the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it's good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods which have not benefited those devoted to them. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of the lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So as I admitted a month ago when we read this passage, this is a very confusing passage for me. So rather than rush through it, I thought we would take a more slow walk through it and really dig deep to see what God is saying. So in the part we're at in Hebrews 13 contains a warning. And it contains a warning to the readers and us not to be led astray by what is classified in verse 9 and 10 as these strange, diverse, and strange teachings. Strange teachings are these things that sound valid and they sound good, but what they end up doing is instead of drawing us towards Jesus for our source of salvation, strength, and significance and security, it actually ends up drawing us away from Jesus. We're surrounded by strange and diverse teachings today because the world looks at our belief system and what does it say? It says, you still believe that? This Christianity, this is a religion that's 2,000 years old. The world around us says that's outdated. And instead it gives us what? Here's this new shiny thing. Here's this new truth. Here's this new way of understanding reality and religion and spirituality. This makes more sense in the modern day. We're surrounded by all sorts of strange teaching outside of the church. But even inside the church, if you think about it, there's all sorts of things that draw us away from Jesus as the source of our salvation, security, significance, and strength. The prosperity gospel is very commonly known. It's this gospel that says what? God's not just there to save you. He's there to give you stuff. And so he's there to help you feel good. He's there to help you have a good life. But even more subtly, there's been this trend lately. There's this catchphrase that people have been using, and I hear it all across the board, and it's this idea of, I'm deconstructing my faith. That's been a very common catchphrase I've heard. I'm deconstructing my faith. In other words, I'm taking my faith apart, I'm taking the things I believed in, and I'm examining it, and really making a judgment about what it is I grew up believing that matters, and what it is that I grew up believing that is probably wrong. And people are deconstructing their faith. And every generation, I think, needs to go through this process. I think it's a healthy process for the church to take a good, hard look at itself and ask itself, in what ways is it deficient? In what ways has it been destructive? And in what ways is it not meeting the culture of the day? So deconstruction, I'm all for it. But the problem is, as we start to deconstruct our faith, all these strange and diverse teachings start to creep into the church. In the past 50 years, there's this big movement that's what's called the emerging or emergent church movement. Anyone ever heard of that? So the emergent church movement has sought to decentralize and de-traditionalize the church and really take a look at how can the church meet the modern day person where they're at more effectively. The problem is the emergent church movement, as good as it intended to be, started to elevate experience over reason. Sounds good though, right? Experience over reason. Subjectivity over objectivity. In other words, the way I experience reality is different than the way you experience reality. It has started to emphasize feelings over truth, spirituality over religion. And it's in this attempt to catch up with modernism that the church has delved into ideas that I think gives us more control over how we mold our faith, gives us more control over how we run church away from the traditionalists, but we also have to be careful that those trains of thoughts and those philosophies are not drawing us away from Jesus, but actually drawing us closer to Jesus. So there's strange teachings all around. And as far as we can tell, the strange teaching that was leading people astray in this time was this call to go back to your Jewish roots. And so there was this call, go back to the way you practiced Judaism before. That's how you get closer to God. Go back to the food laws. Go back to the food regulations. Participate in these meals. Participate in these rituals. That's how you get closer to God. Join us for these events. Do this, and God will love you more. Or you will earn God's love. Do this, right? I grew up Catholic, so this is not very foreign to me. As a Catholic child who was unable to separate the symbolism of our actions from the result of our actions, I thought that what I did was earning God's love. So when I went to confession, and I sat before the priest and I confessed my sins, I thought in some way that that action was earning God's love. I didn't understand that it was through Jesus. When I took communion, I believed that that act was somehow earning me Jesus points, not understanding that it was symbolic. Or we turn to rituals, we turn to traditions, and if we're not careful, those turn to be the things that we go to that really strengthen us. That are the source of our security. And that didn't stop after I became Protestant. Because you know what it became next for me, these traditions in this culture, is I started to convince myself that there were particular places or persons or events where somehow God was moving more powerfully. So for me early on it became what? What's the next big conference? Go to that, because God's moving there. Or for me, what church is God moving in? Go to that church. Go hear that speaker. Which is good, and I'm not saying God didn't move in those things, but the temptation is to start to attach significance and strength and security to the person or to the church or to the event more so than Jesus. That's a strange teaching. That's what strange teachings allow us to do. So to combat this dangerous train of thought, the author of Hebrews goes to the very heart of his audience's Jewishness. And he attacks in a way, or uses in a way, things that are very, very sacred to a Jewish person. And this is a Jewish writer. The reason why he goes to the very heart of their Jewishness to attack this train of thought is because it's so important to obliterate any idea where we think that there is something we can do, some ritual, some tradition, some place we can go to, some speaker we can hear that will draw us nearer to God through our own self-generated methods. So he goes right for it, right at the heart of their culture. Look at verse 9 through 14 again. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it's good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods which have not benefited those devoted to them. And here's where I got really confused. Verse 10. Hang in there with me. Verse 10. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. I'm like, what is it talking about? Okay? What is it talking about? So the author is using imagery from two very specific things in Jewish culture. Number one is the Day of Atonement, otherwise known as Yom Kippur. Second is the temple. The Day of Atonement, known as Yom Kippur. It is a special, if not the most special and most holy day in the Jewish calendar. And there's a few things that happen on the Day of Atonement back then that is relevant to our understanding of this passage. So let's take a little bit of a history dive. Are you going to be okay? All right. So on a day-to-day basis, if you were an Israelite and you had sinned against God, you would come to the temple and you would offer animal sacrifices. And for your sins. Sometimes it would be a goat. Sometimes it would be a sheep or a bull if you're really rich. But if you weren't able to afford such things, what you would do is you would offer maybe a dove or a pigeon. And you would offer these blood sacrifices. The idea being this: I know I'm sinful and I'm about to appear to a God who's holy. So in order for me to appear to a God who is holy and worship him, I got to be clean. But sin has covered me in death. I can't appear before God covered in death. So what the blood represents is the blood represents life. So through the animal sacrifice, the blood sacrifice, I'm able to be covered in life symbolically before a God instead of being covered in sin and death. That's one way they understood it. Another way they understood it was just to understand the seriousness of their sin. Can you imagine You brought this sheep, maybe it's your pet sheep, I don't know. And you have to watch this sheep die. And you have to watch the blood and the life drain out of this innocent animal, not because of anything that they had done, but because of the seriousness of your sin. That your sin cost an innocent life. Can you imagine how that would inject into your mind how serious this problem is? So they would bring these animal sacrifices every day. But the Day of Atonement was different than any other day in the Jewish calendar. Because normally what would happen is the priest would go twice a day to the tabernacle, which was this tent where we understood God's presence to be. So the priest would go twice a day to the tabernacle and offer these sacrifices. But not on the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, the priest would not just go into the tabernacle. The priest would go into what's called the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of God's presence. So if the tabernacle, this tent, was where God's presence was, the Holy of Holies was where God's presence was. It was like the exclusive club that no one was allowed to go to except for in the single day. So the Day of Atonement was very different. But one of the most special parts of the Day of Atonement, of Yom Kippur, is they would take these 2 goats without blemish, and they would cast lots, basically roll a dice. And based on that dice roll, 1 goat would become the sin offering. So the priest would bring in the goat and sacrifice it on the altar. But the other goat would be let free into the wilderness, what we sometimes refer to as a scapegoat. Okay, so here's what it says in Leviticus 16 to get us a better idea. Verse 20, and when he has made an end of the atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. So what it's saying is after he's killed the first goat, the one that maybe bad luck for that goat, then you take the second goat, the live goat. Verse 21, Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. So they would assign somebody to take this second goat and walk them along the path and release them into the wilderness. Verse 22, the goat shall bear all the iniquities onto itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. So there's this goat that was sent into the wilderness, and what that goat represented was the sin of all the people leaving, going away from them. So to them, that goat was almost like this clean, fresh start. It was this picture of God removing your sins as far as the east is from the west, away from you. Now imagine you're an Israelite. And maybe you're so poor you can't even afford a pigeon to give sacrifice to God. And so all year you just know, I'm sinning against God. I have sinned against God. I am not right before God. And this one day a year, that sin that you did, the sins that you've carried around, and even the sins you don't know about, get put symbolically on this goat, and this goat walks further and further away. Can you imagine just watching that goat and realizing that in God's eyes, he's taking your uncleanliness and your death away? Just imagine, you're just watching that goat, going to the wilderness, and to you, for one day, just one day a year, even if the rest of the year is messed up, even if the rest of the year you just feel the sense of guilt and conviction, on that special day, a day you've been looking forward to, it's all good. It's a fresh start, like New Year's. I don't believe in that, but whatever, right? People feel like it's a fresh start. No, it's not. You're the same person you were before. But to an Israelite, that Day of Atonement is this fresh start where everything felt right. It was a special day. But something else very unique happened on that day that ties it back to our passage in Hebrews 13. Usually, in a normal day, there's all these sacrifices, right? So what's left over? Meat. Who gets the meat? The priests get the meat, but the family that bought the sacrifice also gets the meat. They get to eat it off the altar, from the altar. But not on the Day of Atonement. Not on the Day of Atonement. Here's what it says in Leviticus 16. And the bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement for the holy place, shall be carried outside the camp. No one gets to eat this meat. Their skin and their flesh and their dung shall all be burned up with fire, and he who burns them shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterwards he may come into the camp. Let's go back to our verse 10. So keep that in mind. Nobody gets to eat this. This meat gets taken outside. Here's what it says in verse 10 through 12 of our passage. For we have an altar. What's it talking about? The tabernacle altar, where the sacrifices are made. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent, the priests, have no right to eat. Here's the key, verse 11. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as sacrifice for sin are burned where? Outside the camp. So when we read this as a non-Jewish audience, we're like, what are we talking about? But as a Jewish audience, what does your mind go to? Day of Atonement. This special Yom Kippur, this special day. That's what the author of Hebrews is saying. And what is the author of Hebrews saying? There is a better altar than that altar. There is something far greater than that day. Look at verse 12. So Jesus also suffered outside the camp, outside the gate, in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Are we okay? So what is the implication that the author is saying to them? There's something greater than this Day of Atonement. There's something greater than this altar where the sacrifices are made. There's something greater than your Jewish tradition and your Jewish culture. How insulting is that? That this very thing that you've relied on, this very thing that you've looked forward, that day that you look forward to all year, maybe there's fond memories of it throughout your childhood. That day that you look forward to, I want you to forget about that because there's something greater. It's like telling kids we've canceled Christmas. Look at that face. Right? That is the face of the audience here of like, we're canceling the Day of Atonement. Everything that has been culturally significant to you, everything that you have depended on, everything you remember fondly, everything you thought drew you near to God, we're canceling that because there's something greater. So the fellowship meals that you've been participating in, the food laws that you've been trying to participate in, for us, the conferences you go to, the guest speakers that you depend on, the authors that you go to, forget all that, leave it. Because there's a different altar and a different tabernacle. Leave it behind. Turn your back on your culture and traditions. Right? Look at verse 13. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp to bear the reproach he endured. Let us go where? Outside the camp. Outside where? The city is what it's talking about. Outside Jerusalem. So what's the author saying? Leave it. Leave it. Leave your dependency on your traditions. Leave your dependency on your rituals because Jesus is not in those traditions and rituals and celebrations. So leave it. Move on from it. Go outside of it and go to him. Not that those things are bad, not that culture is bad, not that heritage is bad or traditions are bad, but if it's drawing you away from him instead of drawing you towards him as the source of your salvation, strength, and significance, leave it behind. Leave the city. Get out of the city. What's in the city? The temple, where you thought God's presence was. So that city that your ancestors worked so hard to build and were so excited to build. David didn't even get to build this temple and the city because of his sin. Solomon got to build it. This temple that was majestic. This temple that would be the envy of other nations. This temple that contained all these gold and these riches and where God's presence would come. Leave that. Get away from that. This city whose walls you depended on for protection. This city where your ancestors mourned when those very walls were destroyed and celebrated when they rebuilt that wall. Leave the city. Turn your back on that. Jesus is not found there. He is found outside of that. He's outside the walls. You know why? Because when they crucified criminals, they wanted everyone to see them. So they would put the crosses at the intersection of these crossroads of major thoroughfares in that time. So any traveler going east to west, north to south, would see the criminals and laugh and scoff and ridicule. That's where Jesus is. Outside to be seen, not inside these cities and these traditions. Go there. Leave the security. Leave the place you once turned to because you believe God's presence was there in the tabernacle and in the Holy of Holies. Get away from it. As I thought about this passage, I realized a great deal of the call on our lives as Christians is to leave something behind. A lot of times what God calls us to do is to turn our backs on the very things that have helped us feel so secure and safe and to leave things behind. We don't have sacrificial systems. We don't have altars. We don't have food that is holy. We don't have Yom Kippur that bring us closer to God. But there are things in our life that replace Jesus and God's grace and help us find what we're looking for when we want it. We all have our own systems, our own philosophies. We all have our own devices that help us more quickly obtain the security, salvation, strength, significance that is only meant to be found in God. And so God says to us, leave it. Leave what's familiar. Leave the familiar sources of your security and peace and purpose. Because sometimes those things actually prevent us from moving forward. So turn your back on it. Let it go. Because you know what? God is not found in those places, in those systems. Because you know why God's not found in there? Because we've kicked him out. Because the systems themselves fulfill the need that he's meant to. The belief system already gives us the comfort and strength that we need to find in God. The security walls we've built around ourselves, the things we've accumulated in our lives have already filled the role that God is meant to fill. So he's not in that. He's not in your wealth. He's not in your whatever it is that we have built around us and depended on to be the source of our salvation, strength, security, and significance. He's not there, so leave it. It's all, you read the Old Testament. The Old Testament's all about leaving, right? Garden of Eden, leave it. Well, that was their fault. But Abraham, leave this land that was familiar, that you grew up in, to a land that you don't even know. Leave. Go. Leave it behind. Turn your back. Egypt, leave this home that you've had for many generations and go out into the desert because I want to show you freedom. You got to leave it for me to show you freedom. And then you know what's funny? When Israel finally got to settle into this promised land, what happened? They got too comfortable. They built a system around them that became their source of strength, significance, purpose. They got too comfortable in their own strength and their military strength. They got too comfortable in the things God did. They got too comfortable in having a home. So what did God have to do? He had to force them to leave and turn away from that by causing other nations to come and conquer them. It's all about leaving. It's all about letting go and turning away. New Testament, no different. Look at Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. And he called the 12 together, gave them power and authority over all the demons to cure diseases, and sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, this is important, take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money. And do not have 2 tunics. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. So what's Jesus saying? Leave your families. Leave this town that you are used to living in so that you can go minister. So that you can go do something in my name. And guess what? Leave. If whatever's holding you back, whatever becomes your source of security, leave it. So if you think this staff is what's going to help you walk your journey, leave it behind. If you think this bag is what's going to sustain you, what's our bag? Our bag are all the systems we build in so that we can pull out of that bag and deal with all of life's little crises. It's these tool sets that we develop, these security measures that we have, so that when this happens, I can solve it. If this disaster happens, I can solve it. That's our bag. And Jesus says, leave that bag behind, because you're going to think that all your solutions are in that bag when it's meant to be found in me. You think you need food. Leave food. Don't bring food, because you're going to depend on food as a source of your sustenance when you're meant to depend on me as the source of your sustenance. Leave your money, because you're going to think that the money will solve the problem because you can just buy the solution. But no, I'm meant to be the solution. So leave it. Go with nothing. What do you think the disciples found on that journey? I think that they experienced God move in a way that they couldn't have otherwise. I think what they found in there was true significance, true security, true salvation, because they saw God move when they left behind and let go of the things that they would have turned to help them feel better when things got hard. Luke 9:59-62 is even harsher. Here's Jesus talking to people. To another, he, Jesus, said, "Follow me." But the person said this, "Lord, let me first go bury my father." Really practical. I think that's very fair. That's a fair ask. Look at what Jesus says. Jesus said to him, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead." I'm like, whoa, calm down, Jesus. "But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Yet another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home." Very fair. I think that's fair. Why can't I do that? What does Jesus say? "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." Leave behind things that are good and important to you. Let it go so that you can experience me moving forward, so you can meet me. And as I sort of try to think about, here are some specific applications we can do, Pearl Church, to let go of things and turn our back on things, the more I thought that that really did kind of a disservice to what the Spirit might be doing. Because I think for us, God may call us to let go of or leave or turn our back on different things at different times. It looks different for everybody. And what God calls you to do is very serious. So I didn't want to just say, oh, here's one thing you can think of, or here's one thing you can think of. But I can share my experience. Because there have been many times throughout my life where God asked me to let go of many dreams, many hopes, many desires, many systems and passions that actually were good, but drew me away from him. God told me to abandon a career that I thought I would be doing for the rest of my life and studied and worked hard for years. God said, leave that. And then when I decided to switch careers, you know what God told me to leave? He told me to leave job websites. He said, just don't go on those websites. Just forsake it. I'm like, how am I going to get a job if I don't go on a job website? But I clearly felt him saying, just let it go, just leave it behind. Because that is the source of, you think the job website's going to provide. You're crazy, God. God asked me to leave a school that I loved. And I thought I would be teaching there till retirement. And more like concretely, God asked me to leave a country where I was pretty comfortable and had a good friend base, good family base, to come here. There's so many times looking back where God had asked me to give up or to leave a situation that was great, but was becoming the source of my security and salvation. It was my system, my Yom Kippur to earn what I needed. And every single one of those times, when I obeyed, there's other times I disobeyed, obviously, right? I did find that Jesus was there waiting with something better. That when I did leave the job website, the next day was when I was offered a job. That when I did step away from the comfort zone of California, who wants to leave California? I guess like conservatives and people who don't want to overpay for food. When God told me to leave California, I found a great home in Taiwan. I don't regret it. It was hard because I was leaving all that was comfortable. But God always had something in store. himself. And here's why I say this. Because here's what I need us to understand before we close. We're never just called to leave something. We're always called to go somewhere. So as much as God calls us to leave things behind, we're not leaving things behind with no purpose. We're not called to leave something. We're called to go somewhere. We're called to drop things so that we can pick up other things. That's how God works. It's about leaving things behind to go to him. Because so oftentimes we leave the things, we drop the things, but we don't do the second part of going to him. And so we never experience what he's asking us to experience. That we don't realize that when God is asking us to give something up, it's so that we can pick up other things for his kingdom. That when we're asked to leave our comfortable cities, it's so we can experience true dependence on him. That when God asks us to lay down our burdens, it's so we can pick up our credentials to minister to other people. And what are you saying, God? You want me to lay down my issues and let go of my issues to you so that I could minister to other people with the same issues? That's crazy, but yes. We leave to go. We put down to pick up. That's why, what does it say, right? We take off the old self, we put on the new self. It doesn't say you take off the new self and you're happy that you're naked. Like, great, look, I'm a changed person because I took off the old self. But you're naked. No, you put on the new self. It says the old has gone, but it doesn't stop there. What does it say? The new has come. There's always this duality, right? We leave so that God can take us somewhere else. We give up and we turn our back on so God can provide more. We drop so we can pick up. But we can't pick up when our hands are full of the things that we think this is the thing, the ritual, the system, the belief system, the situation that will give me my salvation, strength, security, significance. So here's all I want to say, Pearl Church. It's a tough passage. There may come a time where God is calling you or will call you to drop something, to let go of something. Not because it's a bad thing, but because it's become your place of security. And because that has taken the place of God, because it's replaced God, we can't experience him because we've kicked him out of that. There may be a person or a situation, a way of living, a way of thinking, place, job. I don't know what it is. And let me throw a little wrench in there. It could be that what God is giving you, asking you to give up, is actually the hope of leaving. Is that confusing? That there are other times where my hope and aspirations in life is to leave this difficult situation. But God says, give that up because you think you'll find security and peace in the leaving. But actually, you're going to find me in the staying. A little bit of I want to make things unclear because I think it's very unclear for most of life. Drop it, God says. It's been good to you. These things that I've given you have been good to you. Day of Atonement has been good to you. The wealth that you've accumulated has been good to you. The friends you've accumulated has been good to you. The job, it's all been good to you. But I want you to drop it. I want you to go outside of it because you've enjoyed it and I'm not there to take away your enjoyment, but I'm found outside of it. And I want to maximize your joy in life. That you give up your life so you pick up life more abundant. Jesus is outside many of the things that we cling on to because there's no room for him there. And he invites us all at some point, I'm not saying right now and I'm not looking at anything specific, but there may come a time where God says, just leave it. Drop it. Turn away from it. Go to me. So let's pray.